All right, we've been talking about kind of a different aspect of World War I. Normally, we talk about World War I. We focus on battles and, military action, tremendous loss of human life, things like that. But what we're looking at today, and what we looked at last time, is the effect that World War I is going to have on people that aren't necessarily in battle, or let's say society in general. Last time we talked about how if you're sending millions of men at this point, there are no women in the military at this point really, so you're sending men. So if you have 1 million soldiers, that's 1 million men. You're sending 1 million men who you would assume are able-bodied, at least you would hope so, and who had probably been working, and send them off to become a soldier and go to war. That now means you have 1 million jobs that are not filled. So who's going to fill them? So that's what we were talking about last time. Women begin to fill these jobs that men had traditionally had. And in fact, before the war, let's say in 1910, no employer would have even thought of hiring a woman to be a chimney sweep, or a truck driver, or a farm worker, or even a lot of factory work. Most women worked in certain kinds of factories. Those factories mostly involved textiles. So, making cloth, weaving it, maybe sewing, sewing shirts, dresses, things like that. They would do that kind of work because that was had been, woman's work, right? Put that in quotes, women's work. In other words, this is work that women had traditionally done in the home, and then when it moved to factories, they did it there too. But these other jobs, like loading trucks and climbing up on a high ceiling and lowering down long brushes down into chimneys, right, to clean them out. It's a very dirty job. It's a somewhat dangerous job. This was not something that women did. They would not have been hired to do it. But now, if the men are gone, you got dirty chimney, what are you going to do? Well, I guess if this woman's willing to do it, we'll hire her. Okay? And so they start to do jobs that had been traditionally men's jobs. Now, what happens is, of course, women had worked in factories, like I said, mostly textile factories. And textile, they would receive lower pay. Women received lower pay when they worked outside of the home. Why do you think that happened? What was the rationale? A woman's working in a factory, she gets less money than a man working in a factory. Couldn't even be working in the same factory, she would get less money. I know, I'm not supposed to ask you questions, I'm just supposed to talk. And then you can play your video games and stuff and text people. That's our deal, right? Why am I breaking the contract, the unwritten law? Okay, what do you think? Why were women paid less? Any ladies want to say anything? Any men want to? You're brave enough to say anything? Yes, go ahead.
They were valued less than men. They saw that they were only stay at home and they couldn't really do much, just take care of children. So they were valued less.
Okay, all right. Yes, I guess that's a way to put it. Value. In other words, yeah, go ahead.
Wasn't there an act put in place on women and children that they could only work so many hours?
Yes.
Women
Yes.
would be put in.
That's good because that actually goes back to another class and something else in a different chapter. It's amazing when these things actually connect. Yes, that's true. There were the factory acts that were put into place that limited, say in England anyway, and other places too, limited what kinds of jobs women could have because some were thought to be too dangerous, and children, and limit hours. Well, yeah, part of this is, is it valuing them less? I suppose. But, part of the rationale was this. If I can try to give the rationale. Here would be part of the rationale. First of all, they thought that women were not as strong physically as men. And that some work was, you had to lift heavier weights, you had to load trucks or wagons or stuff with heavy stuff. And men could do that, and women probably couldn't do that, right? Or they might get injured doing that. That was one of the things, physical things. Another thing was, they said, well, women traditionally take care of the children, right? Who's going to take care of the children? And so this is why the women and children things were put together. Back on the farm, women and children definitely worked. But you could kind of supervise, the women could supervise the children, and you could kind of watch out for everything because you're just working, say, on the family farm, and if you needed to leave, you could leave, or you needed to adjust things, you could adjust things. But you go to a factory and you can't. So that meant there was no child care. There was no, what do we call them? Babysitters. Yeah, they didn't have this idea of a babysitter, child care. Well, we got another name for those places. But daycare centers, that kind of stuff. They didn't have that. That's a modern thing. It's very modern. Why didn't they have it? Because children stayed with their mothers, and if their mother went to work, the children went to work. That's what it meant. Take your child to work day was every day. Okay? Maybe it was a little baby, you might be able to find a relative to help. But once they could kind of walk, they were going. And guess what? They were working. You would find some jobs for the child to do. Children are little, right? Most of them. I was never little, but many were. I was born at like 4'9". Very hard on my mother. I'm joking. I wasn't quite that tall. But that means they can get under things easier than I can get under them, right? They can get into spaces that physically I can't even think about getting into. So why not send those kids? You got stuff that's under a table, it's under a machine, it's under somewhere, it's down low on the ground. They're already low on the ground. They like crawling around and monkeying around with this kind of stuff. So let them go down there and grab that stuff out. Get out those little pieces of cloth, of fabric, of threads, whatever it is, and then they bring it out and they pile it up. And then if they pile it up, and then we come around and count it, and we give them some money, or we basically give the mother money. So the mother supplements her pay with her children's work. But here's the thing, I suppose on the positive side, you're not paying for daycare. So, and you're actually with your child. I don't know. Anyway, but that's the way it was. So women and children were kind of thought to go together as a package for a long time, in the 19th century certainly. And so these laws did apply. So you're right, the laws did apply. Part of it was physical, part of it was tradition. Yeah, women work in textile mills. Why? Because women had always worked in textiles. Probably since the first clothing that was ever made, my guess is probably a woman made it or had a lot to do with it. So, and that had continued. Sewing, making clothing, weaving. This had all been things women had done for thousands of years. That kind of thing. And with food, anything to do with food, women had a lot to do with that. So a lot of the jobs women had were involved around food and clothing. And they just they would not even imagine a woman getting up on a chimney, climbing way up on a ladder, way up on top of a building, and taking a very long-handled broom and stuffing it down a chimney and try to brush it out. That's a chimney sweep. Why? They just couldn't picture that. They'd never seen a woman do that. They probably thought a woman didn't want to do that, right? But they thought it was dangerous. And if you lose the woman, you lose the mother of the children, you lose, So sometimes it was physical, sometimes it was tradition, sometimes it was legislative. Some of this stuff had been legislated. But women, here's another thing we have not yet mentioned. women received less pay than men because the assumption was that the woman had a man. See what I'm saying? In other words, there was a family unit. You've got a husband and a wife, and you got, however many children. The husband works, the wife works. So the wife is not the primary money earner in their mind. The wife is supplementing the income, not providing the income. Okay? And so they were traditionally paid less. And by the way, women are still, overall, I don't think in everything, but overall you can find where women are often paid less, even today. So certainly 100 years ago they were. Okay? Now, part of the rationale that had been used to pay the women less is, well, you women can't do these jobs, these tougher jobs, these harder jobs, these more dangerous jobs, so men have to do those. And since there's more risk and harder work or whatever, then the men have earned more money. They will earn more money than you. But when all the men are gone and the women come in and start doing the jobs, they start making ammunition, tanks, loading dock work, all this other kind of stuff, truck driving. When they start doing that kind of stuff, now that argument to say, well, the men had a harder job than you, or physically or whatever, kind of goes out the window. Because, well, no, we're doing the same. Now we're saying, look, we're doing the same job at the same place that this guy did who went off to war, and I'm making less money than he did. Why? So that becomes then all of these actions begin to fuel putting females into the workforce more because of the war effort, is going to start a kind of snowball effect, a chain reaction, I don't know, whatever. In other words, one thing is going to lead to another. The women are in the workplace, now the women can say, look, we're doing the job. We're not getting the pay. You know what else women could not do? We haven't even talked about this. They could not vote. Got to voting, what, is that next week? Week after. Anyway, it's coming up soon. Women could not vote. Men could vote, women could not vote. That's going to become another major issue. Why can't women vote? Why haven't they been able to vote? And so that becomes a major issue in the early 20th century, is to push for women. It's called suffrage movement. Suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. Okay? And so different organizations begin, women begin to organize, and of course, it's going to be in this early 20th century that the right to vote comes. And this was in Europe, not just the United States, in Europe as well, women could not vote. Well, a little more about the women workers. Here's another poster. These women are doing their bit. Learn to make munitions. Here they're trying to encourage women. This poster, as I read it, anyway, is in encouraging women to maybe think about a different kind of job than they'd had, and also to bring it to the awareness of the public. Look, women are now doing their bit. I mean, they are making ammunition. So I think the implication here is, well, if you're a woman, why don't you come and help us? We need the help. You can do it. They're doing it. You can do it. Well, by 1915 in France, a minimum wage had been established for women who worked in their homes. Let's say you have 1 million soldiers. Guess what you need? 1 million uniforms. That's a lot of uniforms. 1 million pair of pants, 1 million shirts, and you might want to have more than one per soldier, right? Some backup anyway. So that's a lot of stuff to make. Well, they didn't really have the factories to do it, and so a lot of this was actually happening in the home. And to encourage that to happen, they began to establish a kind of minimum wage for women who were sewing uniforms in their homes. And by the way, this sort of textile, we talked about it before, you remember cottage industry? The textile work that women did at home had been going on for a long time. Weaving and cutting and sewing, and making garments of various kinds. This had been done in the homes. It was starting to move into factories, especially the weaving part of it. When it came down to sewing, at this point, they didn't really have machine. They didn't have a machine that could just like throw the cloth in there and a shirt comes out, right? That took more skill than the machines had. So women had to do that. And you didn't really need a factory to do that. Didn't really have a factory to do that. So the women could do this in their home. So they were still doing that, say 100 years ago. So that was for home workers making uniforms to have a minimum wage. And by 1917 in France, there was a push for equal pay. But certainly, even by the end of the war, end of World War I, there was not equal pay for equal jobs. So you might argue, well, we don't all get equal pay, right? Because our jobs, different jobs pay different things. Somebody's a doctor, they get paid more than a guy that's doing some other job, right? Presumably, sometimes we think people are making more money than they are. Well, we won't talk about that. I don't want to talk about the details of that. But you might think that, and you say, well, why? Because, it takes more training, more experience, stuff like that. But still, let me point out, doctors have a practice. Why are they still practicing? Guy's going to cut me open. I'm hoping it's not practice. But that's what they call it that. Makes me nervous. Of course, somebody cutting you open always. Here's one thing you'll probably find out in life. You know what the definition of minor surgery is? Surgery done to somebody else. That's minor. If it's done to you, it gets a lot more major, all right? Somebody say, well, that's just minor surgery. Yeah, that's minor surgery because it's not happening to you. They're going to cut you open and pull stuff out or put stuff in. They don't have to cut you open for minor surgery? Surgery is cutting you open. It's an incision. An incision is cutting you open. You got to get the camera in there. Now, you can swallow the camera. They start cutting stuff on you. They're cutting you. Right? They're taking something out or putting something in. Anyway, you can say that now, but wait till they want to start doing that stuff to you. Then your attitude might change a little bit. Anyway, hopefully that'll never happen to you, but it probably will. That's why, see, I'm an optimist. I don't want that to happen to you, but I'm a pessimistic optimist, so I know that it really probably will. Right? All right. That's my pessimistic optimism. But I think that's better than being an optimistic pessimist. I think I've actually moved. Maybe I used to be an optimistic pessimist, and now I've become a pessimistic optimist. I'm moving on the scale of negative thought. I'm getting better. At least in my mind. Well, the workforce, women are in the workforce, and when the war ends, which of course everybody's happy the war ends, but that means any of the guys who have survived and who can still work, a lot of guys died. And then some of the ones that did survive, their life is, like they've lost a leg or an arm or something. So they may not be able to return to the same job. Nonetheless, thousands and thousands of women are forced from their jobs at the end of the war. That means then that women are forced from their jobs and that many of them are then unemployed. Well, go back to what you were doing before. I don't know, whatever that was. You're not doing that here. And still, by the end of the war, women who were working were making less money. Right? They were making less. They didn't have equal wages. Even if they were doing the same job, and then when they were forced into other jobs, of course, they had lower wages. Now, I told you that most people assumed that the household would have a husband and a wife, right? So that the woman, was not the primary moneymaker. Things could affect that. Husbands could die. Husbands could get injured at work. Husbands can take off. It happens sometimes, doesn't it? I think so. At least I've heard about it in the movies. And when that happens, now what happens to the woman? Usually the woman then is left with the children and lower paying job if she can find it, and what's going to happen to her children? Because remember also, they don't have, today what happens is you get your children up to the age of public school, you at least have the window of time that they're in public school that is sort of free child care. Sort of, right? Okay. I mean, in other words, you got from like 8 to 2, 8 to 3 that your child is being watched over and taken care of. So frees you up to get a job or whatever. So this was not the situation 100 years ago. All right. Okay. But that is their situation. All right, I already mentioned this, so let me go to it now. Women's suffrage. Women's suffrage movement. Basically, once the ladies get their opportunity to work and to sort of prove to some skeptical people they can do the job, they're still not getting equal pay. And of course, it comes to them that they are also not able to vote. So this means they can't really have a major impact on changing legislation or voting in candidates that would, have a different view, perhaps, than otherwise may not be voted in. So this is a major, major change. And so women voting becomes a major issue. They don't have that even at the end of the war. Most of them do not have this in Europe or the United States. But there have already started moving. It's sort of like, once they've demonstrated it, it's sort of like they are not going to go back to the way it was. I mean, you take a look at say, women in 1910, even 1905, the clothes they were wearing, what their life was like, what they were doing, on average, and then take a look at it in 1925, 20 years later. It's just a world of difference. The women are not going to go back to the way it was. Some are going to try to take things back to the way they were, but it's just not going to work. It's not going to be the same. The clothing they wear, the jobs they do. Here's the other thing that we haven't really talked about, because these are all things that, anyway. The role of women was very controlled. What do I mean by that? You got a baby girl born, right? That girl grows up in the house, typically has a father, and she will stay in that house until she has a husband. You know what I'm saying? So, if she gets married at 16, 18, 20, she's living with her parents. There's not this sort of transition period. That's what's going to happen after the war. Because like we saw in some of these posters I showed you last time, like the YWCA. Why was that important? Well, if a woman during the war is going to work in a factory and her parents don't live near the factory, maybe her father has a different kind of job and they live, she's going to have to move to another town or another part of town, then she's going to have to find a place to live on her own. That doesn't seem like a big deal to us. That was a very big deal to them. But here you would have this 18, 20, I don't know, young woman living on her own in the town or the city. That was unheard of before the war. If you saw, yeah.
Did they work while at home living with their parents, like the housework?
Sure, yeah, they would work. I think it would depend on the sort of social status, financial status of that home.
Okay, so they wouldn't just work while they're married, they would work at home.
They would certainly do, women, if there was enough money, the basic idea was if you had enough money, the woman doesn't work outside the home. Because it was thought that was the best situation for everyone. For her, for the family, for the husband, for everybody. She stays at home. Now, she's going to do a lot of work at home. This is one I think, fiction that some people say, if a woman stays home, she's not working. Well, I think there's plenty of work at home, right? And she's doing a lot of work. If you got 4 children and a house and stuff, and things to take care of, I mean, you're doing a lot of work. Preparing food, cleaning, laundry, child care. There's a lot of stuff going on. And a lot of those women, if their finances needed for her to do it, then she might do like this sewing of clothing, making uniforms, or other things like that. If you were of a higher social status, you would probably do volunteer work. You would volunteer in civic organizations, that kind of thing. You would go down and, I don't know, at the local church and do something, or the local community, whatever. You would run this and that and do these kinds of things. So it's not like they just stayed at home all the time. But if you were of a higher social status, then you would have other kinds of things that you would do that were not really money makers. Right? Sure. So, but I think otherwise, yes, they would. But that was the idea. So the woman then, the women are staying at home. That would have been what people, at least a lot of people, thought was the ideal situation. And the women could not vote either. Okay, so this situation then, once the women have proved they can do these kind of jobs, and now they're not getting those jobs. Why? Because we're going to go back to this tradition where they don't have it anymore. And a lot of the women are not having it. And they've had to move out of the home. They're moving in maybe the YWCA. But that was, at this time, I can just tell you, 100 years ago or so, in most places, if you saw a young woman who was living on her own, there would have been certain assumptions made about that woman. That she was scandalous. A scandalous woman would live by herself or live on her own out in the city or something. Walk around the city unescorted. That was just not proper. Okay? So, there were women that were doing that, but they were not proper women. Okay, I won't describe it any more than that. I will let you use your imagination, which I know is very vivid because of all of the sensory input you have each day. like you're using different weapons to kill guys from different time periods. I went and spoke to a 5th grade class a few weeks ago. They wanted me to come and talk about Mount Vesuvius and the eruption of they were talking about volcanoes and what the volcanoes did, and they were talking about Mount Vesuvius and Herculaneum, and so they found out I had been there and I knew something about it. So they wanted me to come talk, so I ended up speaking like 3 times. I spoke to like 100 5th graders. And the one thing they kept asking me about volcanoes, I went there, what did I see? Did I see this? And then in all 3 classes, somebody asked me because I brought some lava from Mount Vesuvius and stuff. They wanted to know if I found obsidian there. 5th graders. I said, obsidian? I said, well, obsidian is volcanic glass. It would be formed in volcanoes. I said, I didn't find any there. It's not that common there. I'm sure there's some around. But it just really struck me that here, more than one 5th grader was asking me this. So finally I said, where have you heard about obsidian? Well, it turns out they heard about it in, Minecraft?
Yes.
And then I said, when I heard it in the one class and I got in the next class and they asked me about it, and I was going to say something about it, and the teacher made me stop. I wasn't even supposed to use the word Minecraft in her classroom because she can't get the students to focus on anything in the class. Everything is a game. I said, well, that's pretty much like it is in college, too. Everybody's got a smartphone, a laptop. They're watching Netflix and updating their Instagram and posting on Facebook or whatever it is they're doing, texting their significant others. I'm sure there's more than one. Well, I don't know. I'm just guessing. Anyway, so I said, yeah, it's kind of the same. But, anyway, let's move on. Women's suffrage. All right, let's take a look. Women are going to begin to say, hey, look, we're not going back to the way it was. We're now starting to have this time period where we actually are not sort of under the household of our father, and we're not under the sort of the household of our husband. Look at this. We actually have some time when we are on our own, right? And that was brand new. I mean, that had never really, you'd be hard-pressed to find many, certainly in Europe, Western civilization, where that was the case. Women had always been in this way. On the one hand, you look at it positively, I guess, protected and cared for, but in a negative side, I guess you could say, controlled and supervised, or whatever, right? And so that became more the norm as you get past World War I. Also, what becomes more the norm are women actually getting the right to vote. Women getting the right to vote. Here you see a poster, official program, woman suffrage procession. Washington, D.C., March 3rd, 1913. So you can see the Capitol building. You recognize that. You see the horses kind of all decorated. You see this woman, right? And look at the woman's hair. Cut short. That was new. Women's hair wasn't usually cut that short in a previous era. Look at this woman's hair is kind of short too. The way they cut their hair, the way they dressed, the things they would do in public, they had never done before. It was so scandalous they wouldn't do it before. People would get very upset if they did. But by 1919, Germany, even though it had lost the war, and Austria had given women the right to vote. In Britain, women received a right to vote in 1918, 100 years ago. Less than 100 years in Germany. Okay? Now here in the United States, actually, Prior to World War I, there were areas in the United States where women could vote. Probably don't hear that too often, but it's true. Any idea where in the United States you think people could vote? Because it kind of went state by state, at least at first. Which states do you think would be more likely to have women voting earlier than others? What's that? Don't know? Florida. I don't think so. Yeah. Not the north. No, you would think maybe northeast, Massachusetts, these sort of liberal-leaning states. No.
Texas?
You're getting warmer, yeah. Texas, places in the west.
Okay.
Places in the west, Colorado, Utah. Those are the areas where women got the right to vote first. Often in their charter, when they became states, and some of them became states, in 1880, 1890, women got the right to vote early on, maybe 20, 30 years earlier in the rest of the United States. Why? Well, first of all, they were trying to attract women out there. There weren't many women in, Wyoming and Colorado and Utah and New Mexico, because these are pretty wild areas in 1890. So they wanted to encourage the ladies to come, because they kind of wanted the ladies around, and there weren't many around. And so they actually also, you might say, if you wanted to be cynical, which of course I never am, that you could give women the right to vote because there weren't very many of them. So, they're not really going to be able to change the election if there's only like 10% women than if there's 50% women. See? That makes sense? So that's part of what it is. So the western states, actually prior to World War I, you can find that in the western states of the United States granted women the right to vote before anyone in the east did. But again, there weren't a lot of women out there at that time. Well, so when did women get the right to vote in the United States? Anybody know, roughly? There's a constitutional amendment. Some of you are in the Constitution class, aren't you? Anybody here in that? There's a Constitution class right after this one. Anybody in that? I know one or two of you are. You just don't want to admit it. It actually came as a constitutional amendment that women got the right to vote. It's the 19th Amendment of the Constitution. 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution gives women the right to vote. All right, well, it's the 19th Amendment, so that'll help you remember it, and it happened in 1919. 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed. However, technically, women did not get the right to vote in 1919 because the 19th Amendment stipulated that it didn't happen until 1920. So, it was all processed in 1919. It begins with the elections of 1920. All right? So, in 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed, but it did not take effect until August of 1920, so that women, for the first time, could vote across the United States about 98 years ago, right? Yeah, I guess that would be 98 years ago. This is 2018, that was 1920. So that means, that even the right to vote was very new for women all across Europe and the United States. All of it happening fairly shortly after World War I. Why? I think for all these factors we've been talking about. World War I was the Great War. That is, it involved so much of the world and involved so many people, and so many people died, and so many people's lives were changed, that women moved up into that opportunity and took those jobs. And then when they were kind of forced out of that, they said, look, why? Why can't we have these jobs? Well, because you can't do them. Well, we've been doing them for 3-4 years. What do you mean we can't do them? We've done them. All right? Why can't we have the right to vote? Well, why don't we have equal pay? These are all questions that women began to raise. Now, here in the United States, there was an organization, the organization that formed and undoubtedly led this rally some 6 years before the 19th Amendment, was called the National American Woman Suffrage Association. So see, this is called Woman Suffrage Procession, organized by the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. I guess that's how they'd say it, NAWSA. N-A-W-S-A. It's often abbreviated that way. NAWSA. Now, once women get the right to vote, you don't need a suffrage organization because it's been achieved. But these ladies don't want to disband and say, well, guess the job's done. See you later. No, they actually changed the name of their organization from NAWSA to the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters, by the way, is still around today, 100 years later. And the League of Women Voters, especially in an age, prior to easy access on the internet of information, would publish sort of voter guides, and they would sponsor candidate debates and forums, that sort of, in other words, they would send out a questionnaire to candidates with a list of things. How would you vote on this, or what do you think of this issue, this issue, this issue? How would you respond to this? If you were elected, what would you do about, public schools, and so on? They'd make a list. And if you were running for office, it was pretty much in your best interest to answer that, because the League of Women Voters sort of policy guide, or whatever they called it, voter information guide, was what many, many people looked at. Why? It's hard to know what people think, right? Okay, you know what political party they are, but what do they think about these issues? Now today, of course, although we have a lot more information, I don't know if we really know more or not about what the people think. We know what other people think about those people. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion. But the League of Women Voters was a very important organization, and actually I read a year or two ago that their membership is declining, that younger women are not joining, and I don't know if it will survive. They're trying to recruit younger women to come and be a part of this organization. But a lot of people, younger women evidently don't care about this organization, or they don't think they need it, or they may not even know it exists. Because they get all their information from the web or Facebook. It's amazing to me how much, people do not really read, like significant articles about anything. They just read a tweet, or they see a little post on Facebook and people go crazy. Or they get a little clip, like they'll take a little 10-second, 30-second clip, and that will come to define, or a meme, it'll last 3 seconds or something. That comes to define the whole person, the whole candidate, the whole everything about them. So you take a phrase, you take a statement, even part of a statement that somebody made, and then that just blows up, and that's all anybody, oh yeah, that guy said he didn't like this, or didn't like that, or didn't do this, or would do this, and that's it. That's all the information that I guess you think you need. Now, so, the way you vote, a lot of people think the way you vote doesn't matter. I've met a lot of people like that. A lot of college students. You going to vote? No, I'm not going to vote. Why? It doesn't matter. You know, my vote doesn't count. My vote doesn't really matter. Okay? Your vote does matter. It does count, and elections do have consequences that will make a difference. So, I guess I'm encouraging you to vote. Some people have this attitude that I've met that they don't want people to vote who are not well informed. And so they're actually happy when people say, I'm not going to vote. Why? Because they figure, well, if you're not going to vote, you probably vote the wrong way, or that means you're not going to vote the way I want you to vote. So I don't know if you'd vote the way I'd want you to vote, but I still think you should vote. Okay? I encourage you to vote. And I would also add to that, I encourage you to actually take a little time and investigate rather than just the little clips that you hear on commercials and stuff. To try to get to the thing, Well, there you go. Election's coming up. There's my little plug for voting. Now, what about other changes for the ladies? Now, take a look at this lady. Scandalous, wouldn't you say? Well, many people thought so. This is from the 1920s. Take a look at her hair. Short cut. What do you ladies call it? A bob? I don't know why ladies name their hair after a guy's name. Bob, but there it is. And look at this. I mean, look at this arms. What is this? Short dress, arms. Look at that makeup. Lots of makeup. These are all things you would not have seen 10 years before. Before World War I, women would not have had such short hair. They would not have been wearing that kind of makeup. They would not have been wearing that kind of a dress. This would have been like underwear in 1910, right? A slip that you would wear under a dress. And women were wearing very long dresses, even when they went swimming. They swam in a dress, basically. They went out and waded in they were not showing any skin, very, very little. Like I said, you might see their hands, might see their face, maybe their feet. That was it. But look at this. A lot of arm there, a lot of neck. And we're not showing it, but there would have been a lot of leg being shown there too. Okay? That was all new. After World War I, women began to live apart from their family. That is to say, apart from their family home, their father and mother and stuff. They were going out and they were having this period of time when they were on their own. Begin to live alone in apartments. Begin to get a job somewhere and move out of the parents' home. And they were not married. This was not done prior to World War I. I mean, it was not acceptable to do. I won't say nobody did it. But it was becoming now accepted. This was a viable option for respectable women to be able to go out and live on their own in the city, and to have a job and to have their own place, and to dress like this. These women, the nickname they had were flappers. Flappers. You ever heard of them? And they would dance. I don't know if you ever seen the kind of dancing they were doing. That's how they got the nickname, because they're flapping their arms around, they're flapping their legs around. This was, they would have never. That was completely different than 10 years before. I mean, it's just really amazing. If you go back and watch, say, 1900, 1910, women walking around and what they're doing in public, and then you see what they're doing in 1920, 1925, I mean, it's like night and day. It's a radical, radical change. It doesn't seem like it to us today, but it did then. Women had really major change, and the only thing you can point to is World War I. World War I helped make that change. I'm not saying it's the total thing, but it's the main thing, because it's what changed the woman's attitude. It changed society's attitude to a large extent and changed the economic systems and so forth. Here's another thing women would do in public. Smoke in public. They had never done that. I'm saying women never smoked, but they smoked at home. They did not smoke out in a public place where people could watch them. That was considered very scandalous, but they started to do it. Wearing the shorter dresses. Again, scandalous. I mean, in 1910, if you could see a woman's ankles, she was kind of risque. Now, you got pretty short skirts, above the knee, right? And I don't know how far. Some of them quite a bit above the knee. And, like this, sleeveless little straps, spaghetti straps, what do you call them? I don't know all the names for all the ladies' stuff, but you know what I'm talking about. So in the past, there would have been long sleeves, primarily, and a long dress. And even take a look at the cloth. I mean, it's got giant polka dots on it, right? Really drawing attention to the lady. And a lot tighter fitting. Before the dresses were big and flowing, right? Couldn't really kind of tell, what was under there. But later on, they're wearing much tighter dresses, leaving much less to the imagination, I guess is what I'm saying. And of course, the use of cosmetics, makeup, eye liner, shadow, lipstick, I don't know, all that stuff. They're using a lot more of it. In the past, it had really not been used. But this is when it started. And it was meant as a form of freedom, as a form of expression. I'm going to do this. This is what I want to do. So they did. Okay? In the past, that would have been, their father would never, in 1910, he would never allow his daughter out of the house like this, nor a husband. But in 1920, 1925, they're out there living on their own, and this is what they're doing. This is what they're dressing. This is how they're doing it. Okay? So, whatever you want to call that, things had definitely changed for women. Also, the new hairstyles. The new hairstyles, as you can see, we've already pointed out, this much shorter hair, and, the other thing that was popular in the 1920s, became very popular for the ladies, is that in the 1920s is when they discovered King Tut's tomb. King Tut's tomb. And so the Egyptian artwork became the inspiration for fashion. And a lot of Egyptians had their hair cut in this fashion, shorter like this. And also with the kind of dressing, the sort of dresses they had and clothing they had. So this Egyptian style really caught on in the 1920s as well. I saw pictures of my relatives from the 1920s, and they're definitely dressing, the ladies are dressing in this new style, right, sort of looks like the people on the tomb walls, right? So that was the inspiration for it, and that's why it happened. All right, any question there? Everybody got that? All right, good. So a lot of things, the times they are a-changin'. Well, that was a song from the 60s, but you could have definitely had a song like that in the 1920s. Women voting, women living on their own, dressing differently. The whole culture had changed. And, of course, women still did not have equal pay. In many regards, they don't still today. And they didn't have this sort of equal footing, equal situation. But it had greatly changed in a short amount of time. So by the time we get to the end of the war then, in January of 1919. We haven't really talked in here about the United States' role in this war. We'll probably do that next week, I guess, a little bit more. But one of the leaders, I don't know if you know who this guy is. Anybody recognize this guy? No idea? Well, it's got an American flag, so that he's an American. We can give you that clue. That narrows it down somewhat. He was a president. Yes, very good. Which president? Woodrow Wilson. Yes, exactly. That's Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was president during the time of World War I here in the United States. He had been an academic. He had been at Princeton University. I believe I don't know if it was before or after he was president. He became I think he was president of Princeton University first, and then he became president of the United States. Or maybe it was the other way around after he left. I think it was before, though, because his health really declined while he was in the presidency. Okay? Yeah, so it was before. But anyway, he was an academic, and he was, he wanted to get the United States involved in the war. He wanted to get the United States, but you know what? The feeling in the United States was to stay out of the war. This is not our war. This is a European war. That's what the view was. And the United States had a kind of a situation that was called isolationism. We wanted to be isolated from the rest of the world. We don't want to get involved in the rest of the world. We don't want to send troops there. We don't want to do anything. You just leave us alone. We'll leave you alone. That was sort of the basic outlined principle that was there. So Woodrow Wilson had a very hard time. He was arguing that the United States needed to get into this war, that this was an important thing, and that Europe could be completely altered if we didn't, and that would not be a good thing for the United States. And so he tried, with little success, at doing that. And once the United States did get involved, it was somewhat reluctantly, especially by Congress. The event that brought the United States to the brink of war was the sinking of a submarine. Or not a submarine. Sinking of a ship by a submarine, the Lusitania. Now this had happened earlier. We mentioned it, I think, briefly before in here. But the Lusitania was actually a British ship that was sailing from England to the United States and back, to New York. Okay? The Germans in World War I introduced a brand new kind of weapon, a brand new submarine, a U-boat called the Unterwasserboot, the underwater boat, that was very small by our standards today. I mean, if you look at a submarine today, you look at one of those, tiny, but and it was very rudimentary. Didn't have all the kind of censoring and all the sort of weapons that, of course, we have on submarines today are unbelievable. But at that time, it was a periscope and a couple of torpedo tubes, and they could submerge themselves and look up through the periscope, and they could then sail in. They could just go into, mainly what they do is try to go into a harbor area where a lot of ships were there for repairs or just at harbor and on the deck, and then they would fire at them, blow them up in the harbor. And of course, if you sink them in the harbor, it has a couple of effects. Not only you get rid of the ship, but you mess up the harbor at the same time and make it harder to get ships in and out of the harbor. Okay? So, that's what they would do. Now, here's the other thing that was happening. England was getting supplies. They had pretty much been cut off from Europe, right? There was no, the German Navy and stuff had pretty much made sure there were no goods coming from Germany, certainly, or France. It was very hard for the British to get supplies. So what were they doing? They were getting supplies from the United States. Getting supplies from the United States. And that's what was happening. Okay? And part of the way they did this, they knew if they sent cargo ships, the cargo ships were being attacked, sunk by U-boats and other boats. And so what they started to do then was to send goods on passenger boats. In the cargo hold of the passenger boat, they would load it up with goods. Now sometimes it was, supposedly it was supposed to be just humanitarian supplies. Food, medicine, stuff like that. But they started to send other things. They started to send weapons, ammunition, things like that. Of course, the Germans found out about it. They knew about it. And they actually, and I'll probably show you this next week, they took out a full-page ad in the New York Times newspaper, which at that time was, one of the best ways to get your message out, right? Especially in New York. A full-page ad that said, maybe it wasn't a full-page ad. They did take out an ad in New York Times. Let's not say it's full-page. And what it said was, warning, basically, to anyone sailing on passenger ships bound for England. These ships are subject to being attacked by our boats. So we just want to tell any people in America, don't get on those ships. Don't sail that way. Well, of course, people didn't pay attention to that, and they went ahead and did it anyway. And they actually sunk the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a passenger ship. It was not a cargo ship, but it definitely was carrying military supplies. Now, they hit it with a couple of torpedoes, which would eventually sink the ship. However, what happened was, what they've now determined, the ship broke in half almost immediately and sunk in just a few minutes. So that lots of people died. Hundreds, thousands of people died on this ship, which was a surprise to the Germans that the thing sunk so quickly, because you put a couple holes in a ship like that, maybe a fire catches on, it starts to take on water, and you're going to have, a couple hours maybe to get everybody off of there. This thing went down in minutes. Why? They believe it's because it was at the end of its journey. They actually fired on it in the Irish Sea. It was pretty close to, getting to where it was. And those ships were were run on steam, which used coal. So they had big bins of coal that had been shoveled into the furnace to heat up the water to keep it going. By the end of the journey, the ship hold was now about empty. So what does that mean? It had a big empty room. It had a little bit of coal in it, and it had coal dust. And so the torpedo happened to hit one of those rooms. And when the torpedo exploded, the room exploded because of the coal dust. And that magnified the effect of the torpedo. And these two torpedoes then actually broke the ship in half with this other explosion. And it just started to sink rapidly, and there were very few survivors from this ship, the Lusitania. And so this created, because there were 200 or 300 Americans on that ship. So now this became an issue for America. We've stayed out of the war. Now the Germans have killed Americans on a passenger ship. See? What are they doing? They shouldn't be doing that. So people got up in arms and thought, well, maybe we should go to war. But even then, they didn't go to war. They issued a decree that said if Germany continued attacking passenger ships, that the United States would enter the war, because it already resulted in Americans dying. And the Germans backed off. They did not attack passenger ships for about a year and a half. But when the Germans began to attack passenger ships again, that's when the United States entered the war. So that's how Woodrow Wilson got us into the war. Once we got into the war, Woodrow Wilson really wanted to become a major player in this because the United States is now emerging. One of the big changes after World War I, besides, say, women's issues and social things, is the political standing of the United States. It becomes clear now that the United States is a world player. We are a world power. We had not been that before. We've certainly not been considered that before. But after World War I, we came into the war. Spoiler alert, the Germans lose, just in case you didn't know. So the United States was pivotal in that. And Woodrow Wilson wanted to have a seat at the table, which he does have a seat at the table. But he had a real vision for what he thought, the way he thought the world should be at the end of World War I. He saw it as the war to end all wars. So he wanted to start an organization. He wanted to establish eternal peace. That was his hope. That was his dream, I guess. Obviously, we know that didn't happen. And he had his famous 14 points. His 14 points, or Wilson's 14 points, as they're often called, were 14 things 14 recommendations, 14 things that should happen or should not happen, I guess, at the end of World War I. One of those was very controversial: to be merciful to Germany. It became clear Germany was going to lose the war. But Wilson said we should have victory without victors. Victory without victors. How can that be? Well, basically it means, I can tell you what the French wanted. Definitely. And the British, is they wanted to punish Germany. Because they said Germany started this war. Germany, especially France, France had been a major battlefield of this whole war. Large sections of France looked like the moon. There was no vegetation. There were big craters and mud and stuff there. And millions of people had died. And so they blamed the Germans for that, and they wanted the Germans to pay. They wanted to pay a lot of money, wanted them to pay a lot of money. They wanted to assure that Germany never could do this kind of thing again. And so Wilson did not really win out in this thing, this idea, because Germany was punished even though he didn't want them to be punished. Another thing he wanted to happen was a formation, which did happen. It was called the League of Nations. The League of Nations is sort of like the United Nations. You might think of it as the forerunner of the United Nations. But the League of Nations was around for a while, but it was never very strong because it's kind of interesting that it was Wilson's idea, right? But the United States never joined. Congress did not want to join the League of Nations. Why? They felt that it was handing over some sovereignty or sovereignty of the United States to another organization. This is still what some people think about the United Nations today. Some people are opposed to it because it, has the giving up some of our sovereignty. Well, we have more here, but I know. Now wait a minute, it's not 1:15 yet, so I've never let you out, they've said, before 1:15. It's 1:14, maybe 30 seconds. All right, look at that. Don't ever say I didn't let you out early.